The tip arrived on a rainy evening, slipped beneath the journalist's door in a plain, unmarked envelope with nothing but a set of coordinates and a single word: warning. The message carried no return address, yet it pressed itself into the mind like a living thing, gnawing at reason and curiosity in equal measure. For weeks, the journalist pored over old newspapers, archives, and fragmented recollections from elderly locals who muttered about vanished children and caretakers spoken of only in fear. Satellite images showed a roof swallowed by overgrowth, a place hidden deep in the forest, unreachable by road and almost erased from memory. The pull was irresistible, an invisible hand tugging at the journalist to uncover what had been intentionally buried. When they arrived, the forest itself seemed to resist their approach. Branches clawed at clothing and hair, and shadows twisted unnaturally in the weak glow of a flashlight. Hours of trudging, the orphanage, broken, a hulking mass of blackened walls and crooked windows. The front doors hung ajar, creaking in the wind, as if inviting the journalist to step inside while simultaneously warning them away. Inside, the smell of decay, damp wood, and something unidentifiably metallic pressed against their lungs. Broken toys, tiny shoes, and tattered clothing were strewn across the floor, each item a silent witness to lives disrupted, as if the children had vanished mid-step. Faded scrawls on the walls hinted at pleas, instructions, and symbols that twisted innocence into obsession. A loose floorboard revealed a hidden passage descending into darkness. The air grew heavier, thick with mold, rust, and the faint chemical tang of experiments long abandoned. At the end lay a chamber, tables lined with jars, mannequins in grotesque poses, anatomical sketches of deformed children pinned to boards. The orphanage had not merely housed children, it had reshaped them, catalogued their deformities, and preserved every trace of twisted ambition in subterranean halls. Whispering began, soft and unintelligible at first, then forming fragmented words like stay and play, echoing off the walls and circling the journalist, threading dread into every nerve. Photographs revealed children posed unnaturally, paired or alone, their features subtly wrong, and journals detailed rituals designed to create more children like them, a cycle of deformity perfected over decades. Shadows moved, flickering forms coalescing into a childlike apparition that guided the journalist deeper, leading to the heart of the orphanage's secret, a massive chamber where the mastermind's presence lingered, where decades of cruelty and obsession pulsed like a living entity. Every path, every creaking floorboard, every whisper was part of a calculated design, a law that ensured the orphanage's horrors endured. The trapdoor at the far end offered the illusion of escape, yet the building itself resisted, as if alive, aware, and hungry for witnesses. The whispers grew coherent, repeating insistently, the line must continue, the cycle must endure. The journalist realized, with a tightening in the chest, that leaving was never a certainty. The orphanage waited patiently, patient as the shadows, patient as the children whose deformities had been crafted here, patient as the malevolent presence that had never truly left, and now it had claimed a new observer. The tip arrived on a rainy evening, slipped beneath the journalist's door in a plain, unmarked envelope that carried no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore a scrawled message, a set of coordinates, a name, and a warning that no one who went there had ever returned unchanged. The words themselves were almost laughably vague, but beneath them lurked an unsettling certainty, an invisible weight pressing at the edges of perception. It was enough to ignite curiosity, the kind that gnawed at the edges of reason and drew the mind into dark places it had long avoided. For weeks, the journalist found themselves haunted by those few lines. Every passing headline, every story about abandoned buildings or local legends seemed to echo the same dreadful possibility that this place might be more than rumor. Friends warned against pursuing it, shrugging off the envelope as a hoax, but the journalist could not dismiss the strange mixture of dread and fascination that coiled in the gut like a living thing. They began researching, digging through old records and newspaper clippings, trying to locate the orphanage mentioned in the note. The archives were frustratingly incomplete. Pages had been torn from some documents, photographs were faded to the point of abstraction. Interviews with elderly residents yielded only fragmented recollections, muttered rumors of children who had vanished, or caretakers whose names were spoken with fear, as if invoking them aloud might call them back. One historian, a quiet man with trembling hands, described the orphanage as a place that should never have existed, and refused to elaborate further. Yet even the historian's sparse words carried weight, embedding a notion of inevitability into the journalist's mind. Maps revealed a structure tucked deep within the forest, unreachable by main roads and swallowed by years of overgrowth. Satellite images were old, showing only the faint outline of a roof and jagged shadows where windows might have been. A photograph of the grounds, taken decades earlier, revealed nothing extraordinary at first glance, until the journalist noticed the shapes in the corners of the frame, small, crouched figures whose faces had been blurred beyond recognition. Every lead seemed to twist the path further inward, like a labyrinth designed to keep the truth out of reach. The sense of urgency grew, not just to uncover the story but to witness it firsthand, to confirm whether the whispered horrors were real or a product of collective imagination. The decision to follow the tip felt less like choice and more like compulsion. There was a strange inevitability to it, a feeling that the orphanage had been waiting, patient and hidden, for someone curious enough to stumble upon it. The coordinates were more than numbers, they were a summons, an invitation, and perhaps a trap. Night after night, the journalist imagined the walk through the dense forest, the first glimpse of the broken gates, and the echo of forgotten screams in the empty halls. Each vision was sharper, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore the magnetic pull drawing them toward the abandoned place where secrets had festered long enough to become monstrous. The forest was a living, suffocating presence, its branches clawing at the journalist as if trying to warn them away. The path had long since vanished, replaced by a tangle of roots and fallen leaves that muffled every step. Shadows twisted unnaturally in the weak glow of the flashlight, and the occasional snap of a twig echoed like a shout in the oppressive silence. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and each bend in the path seemed to lead only deeper into the heart of the forest. Then, through the dense fog that hung low to the ground, the faint outline of a building emerged, hulking and broken, more a shadow than a structure. Its walls, mottled with blackened streaks of rot and weather, leaned at impossible angles, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Windows were empty eye sockets, and the front doors hung crooked on their hinges, creaking with the faintest wind. The air changed as soon as the building appeared, heavier and almost viscous, carrying a smell that was faintly metallic, almost sweet, and yet unbearably wrong. The journalist approached cautiously, boots crunching against the debris-strewn path, and with each step, a growing sense of wrongness coiled tighter in the chest. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on stone, reverberated from somewhere inside, though the building looked impossibly empty. As the doors groaned open, the darkness inside seemed to pull at the light, swallowing it whole. The air smelled of decay, damp wood, and something far more unsettling, something alive, though no living thing was visible. The floors creaked under weight that might have belonged to ghosts, and dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the feeble beam of the flashlight. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every shadow a movement just beyond the eye's reach. The remnants of the orphanage were everywhere. Broken toys lay scattered in hallways, their colors muted by decades of neglect. Tiny shoes were lined against the walls, as though children had simply stepped out and vanished. Torn curtains fluttered without wind, and old photographs, their glass cracked and faces obscured by time, stared out from frames like silent witnesses. The journalist's pulse quickened with both fascination and fear. There was something unnatural about the symmetry of the decay, the way the building seemed to breathe around them, responding to their presence. A low, almost imperceptible hum resonated through the floorboards, vibrating through bones and nerves, and the journalist realized that the orphanage was not just abandoned, it was waiting, patient and deliberate, as though aware that someone had finally arrived to see what should never be seen. A faint sound, like the distant laughter of children, drifted down the hallway. It was soft, warped, and agonizingly out of place, as though the walls themselves were mocking the intruder. The journalist's hands shook, but a mixture of dread and obsession kept them moving, deeper into the building, toward a darkness that promised answers yet threatened to swallow them entirely. The journalist's flashlight swept across the hallway, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, landing on scattered remnants that made the chest tighten with unease. Broken dolls lay in awkward poses, their glassy eyes reflecting the weak light like tiny mirrors to a forgotten world. Tattered clothing, threadbare and stained, littered the floor as though children had vanished mid-step, leaving behind only fragments of their existence. The walls were scrawled with childish handwriting, faded to near invisibility, yet still legible enough to send shivers down the spine. Names, dates, and strange phrases were etched into the plaster: please, perhaps, or instructions, impossible to tell. Some of the words twisted unnaturally, letters merging into symbols that hinted at something far darker than childish scribbles. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly coppery, like blood long dried into the fibers of the walls. Tiny footprints, some small enough to belong to toddlers, pressed into the dust, leading down a narrow hallway that ended abruptly in a collapsed section of the floor. Yet the trail continued, as though the children who had walked here had left behind not just prints but traces of a presence that lingered beyond physical decay. It was in these scattered belongings, these fragments, that the journalist sensed the first undeniable evidence of what had occurred. This orphanage had not simply housed children, it had shaped them, experimented upon them, transformed them into something the world had never been meant to witness. Among the ruins, the journalist found journals, their pages yellowed and brittle, covered in handwriting that shifted from innocence to obsession. Accounts of daily routines, meal times, chores, bedtime rituals suddenly diverged into strange instructions, lists of physical deformities to be noted, sketches of limbs and faces drawn with clinical precision yet tinged with cruelty. One journal described a child in exacting detail: the shape of the skull, the width of the eyes, the unnatural arch of a spine. Another page contained calculations, almost mathematical in their focus, as if the children were variables in a horrifying experiment. Each line reinforced a growing realization: the orphanage had been less a home and more a laboratory for creating the unnatural, a place where the boundaries of morality had been obliterated in pursuit of some incomprehensible goal. The more the journalist examined these clues, the more the building seemed to respond. Faint creaks echoed like whispered warnings, and shadows shifted just beyond the beam of light, suggesting that the children, or the remnants of them, were not entirely gone. Each artifact, the shoes, the torn dresses, the journals, the crude sketches, was a testament to lives distorted, manipulated, and trapped in the memory of the walls. The weight of it pressed down, a suffocating certainty that what had happened here was not merely history. It was alive, lingering, and the orphanage had already claimed attention, had already chosen its next witness, and the journalist could feel, with mounting dread, that the first clue was only the beginning of something far more sinister than imagination could contain. The journalist's hand trembled as it brushed against a section of the floor that felt subtly uneven, a depression almost imperceptible under the thick layer of dust. Something about it drew attention, a compulsive pull that overrode logic, and with careful fingers, they pried at the worn wooden plank. It shifted with a groan that sounded far too loud in the oppressive silence, revealing a narrow gap beneath. A cold draft seeped upward, carrying with it a scent that was both metallic and decayed, promising discoveries no one should ever encounter. Kneeling, the journalist hesitated for a fraction of a second, feeling a shiver coil through the spine like a living thing, before lifting the plank fully and revealing a dark cavity beneath the floorboards. The space was barely large enough to squeeze into, but the faint, unnatural glow of the flashlight illuminated the entrance to what unmistakably was a hidden passage, carved and reinforced long ago, though its purpose had been buried under decades of neglect. Descending into, the air grew colder with every step deeper into the passage beyond the chamber, and the whispers seemed to attach themselves to the skin, crawling along nerve endings in an almost tactile presence. At first, the journalist tried to rationalize it, telling themselves it was the wind or the echoes of the building settling after decades of abandonment, but the sound refused to obey reason. Occasionally, one phrase would surface clearly enough to freeze the blood, a single word like stay, or play, spoken with the warped intonation of something both childlike and inhuman. The whispering moved in patterns, circling, retreating, then returning, coaxing, probing, as though testing the journalist's courage or their sanity. Shadows along the walls seemed to stretch toward the sound, elongating and curling unnaturally as if they too were participants in some secret dialogue. The journalist's flashlight flickered, briefly revealing glimpses of the impossible, the faint outline of a small figure standing just beyond reach, dissolving the moment the light steadied. A chill ran down the spine as footsteps, soft and uneven, echoed in tandem with the whispers, though the floor beneath remained undisturbed. The effect was disorienting. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, threading through the brain like needles, planting a sense of dread that no rational thought could pierce. There was a rhythm to it, like breathing, deep, measured, insistent, and the journalist realized it was not a sound made by wind, wood, or distant wildlife, but by something alive within the walls, something patient and aware. With every beat of the heart, the whispers grew more insistent, more intimate, speaking directly to fear, memory, and guilt. They suggested motion in unseen corners, beckoning the journalist to follow, yet warning them at the same time, a paradox that tightened the chest like iron bands. The oppressive sensation of being observed, of being invited and trapped simultaneously, left a residue of terror that made it impossible to focus solely on the room's grotesque contents. The whispers were more than echoes of past children, they were the remnants of their torment, an auditory residue of lives twisted into a pattern of obsession and cruelty, and the journalist knew, deep in the marrow, that these voices would not let them leave unmarked, would not allow the story to be told without exacting its own toll. As the journalist's eyes adjusted to the dim light of the chamber, they noticed a small wooden crate tucked into a corner, its surface thick with dust and cobwebs. Curiosity, sharpened by both fear and obsession, drove them to lift the lid, revealing a collection of photographs stacked haphazardly, yellowed with age. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary pictures of children, smiling faces, group poses, snapshots of daily life, but the closer the journalist examined them, the unease deepened. Something was not right. The children's features were subtly, disturbingly wrong. Limbs appeared slightly elongated or bent at impossible angles, eyes set too wide or too close, teeth too sharp or misshapen. The deformities were not monstrous at first sight, just uncanny, as though someone had attempted to create perfection and failed, leaving behind twisted echoes of innocence. The photographs were organized methodically, each child appearing in multiple images, sometimes alone, sometimes paired with another. Oddly, there was a pattern to the poses. The children were always placed in ways that highlighted their physical anomalies, as if the photographer had been documenting evolution in real time. Notes were scribbled on the backs of several prints, written in precise, almost clinical handwriting. Measurements, descriptions, and observations filled the margins: head circumference, limb ratios, eye placement, even the reaction of the child to the camera's presence. The journalist realized with a growing chill that these were not mere photographs but records, cataloging not memories but experiments. One photograph in particular froze their blood. A small child, no older than 7, stood rigidly in a corner of a room, hands folded unnaturally. The face, though barely recognizable in the grainy black and white, radiated a blank, haunted expression, a hollow stare that seemed to pierce through the lens and into the journalist's very chest. The shadows in the photograph hinted at movement in the background, shapes that were too irregular to be furniture, too fluid to be accidental. It was as though the camera had captured more than a child, it had captured an essence, a lingering presence that had survived the passage of decades. Stack after stack revealed the same horrifying pattern. Every child photographed bore the mark of the orphanage's obsession, the twisted intent to reshape human life into something unnatural. The more the journalist looked, the more the sense of being watched grew, as if the eyes in the photographs had not faded with time, but continued to observe, tracking each movement, silently judging the intruder. The weight of it was suffocating. Each image was a window into lives distorted and a testament to cruelty that had persisted beyond reason or morality, and the realization settled like a stone in the stomach. The orphanage had left behind more than memories, it had left behind witnesses, small and silent, whose stories were etched permanently into the paper, waiting for the next living soul brave or foolish enough to see them. The journalist stumbled upon a journal unlike the others. Its leather cover cracked and worn, emanating a faint, almost imperceptible odor of chemicals and decay. The handwriting inside was meticulous, obsessive, almost surgical in precision, chronicling daily routines with an unsettling blend of care and cruelty. At first, the entries seemed innocuous, detailing meals, chores, and bedtimes, but soon the tone shifted. The words became ritualistic, describing ceremonies meant to mark the children in ways that were impossible to reconcile with morality or sanity. There were drawings of circular patterns, symbols scrawled in blood-red ink, and instructions that suggested preparation for some repeated, unnatural process. The journalist's pulse quickened as they deciphered the passages. It was no record, It was a blueprint for the orchestration of deformity, an ongoing experiment cloaked as tradition. One entry, dated decades prior, detailed the steps of a ritual that involved gathering the children at precise times, positioning them in patterns that mirrored celestial alignments, and observing their responses to both fear and stimuli meant to manipulate growth and development. It was methodical and deliberate, a cruel merging of superstition and scientific curiosity. The journal described the use of mirrors, liquids, and instruments designed to measure and induce physical changes, all recorded meticulously in accompanying diagrams. The language was clinical yet lyrical, each phrase dripping with reverence for the process, as though the ritual were a sacred act of creation rather than a mechanism of torment. As the journalist turned the pages, a terrible realization emerged. The ritual was not an isolated practice but a continuous cycle, meant to perpetuate itself across generations. The children were not only subjects but progenitors, manipulated into creating others like them, their deformities catalogued and refined with each iteration. Notes described pairing of certain children, careful observation of inherited traits, and the recording of success or failure with a precision that suggested decades of unbroken practice. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken as the journalist imagined the orphanage alive with whispers, laughter, and screams, every act of cruelty performed in the name of this enduring, perverse ritual. A single phrase repeated across multiple entries stood out, scrawled in uneven, urgent script: "The line must continue. The design must persist." The journalist felt a chill press against their ribs, a realization that the ritual had not ended, that its echoes lingered in the hidden corridors, in the photographs, in the shadows that shifted just beyond vision. The building itself seemed to hum in recognition, responding to the uncovering of its secret, as though the very walls remembered every repetition of the ceremony, every child bent to its will. It became clear that this was no mere historical curiosity. The ritual had shaped the orphanage into something alive, patient, and waiting, an eternal crucible of deformity, observation, and a horror that could not be buried or ignored. The journalist's flashlight flickered as they moved deeper into the passage beyond the hidden chamber, and for a moment, the oppressive darkness seemed to close in entirely. That's when they saw it, a shadow at the edge of perception, a movement too fluid to belong to anything human. The figure was small, childlike, but there was something unnatural in its gait, a disjointed, jerking motion that made the skin crawl. It vanished the instant the beam of the flashlight swung directly toward it, leaving behind only a lingering sense of presence, a pressure in the chest that was almost physical. The air grew colder, and a whisper, soft and distorted, slithered around the walls like smoke. The journalist's pulse hammered in the ears, each beat echoing like a warning, as if the orphanage itself were aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every tremor of fear. They advanced cautiously, eyes scanning the edges of the long-abandoned corridors, but the figure reappeared repeatedly, always at the periphery, never directly confronted. Sometimes it seemed curious, tilting its head, observing the intruder with empty, hollow eyes that reflected neither light nor life. At other times, it darted away with unnerving speed, dissolving into shadows as if it had never been there at all. The journalist felt a growing sense of disorientation, a vertigo born not of the terrain but of the uncanny persistence of the apparition, an entity tethered to the orphanage by something older and darker than human comprehension. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the appearance of the figure, shadows stretching and contracting, whispering incomprehensible words that rose and fell in pitch as the childlike form drifted closer and farther away. Each step forward was met with a tightening in the chest, a weight of unseen attention, as if the building were alive with memory, with residue of every child who had passed through its halls. The apparition led the journalist deeper, through narrow hallways and rooms that had been sealed for decades, until the floorboards shifted beneath their feet, revealing spaces that were both familiar and alien, like glimpses into a distorted reflection of reality. In one room, the apparition paused at the center, and for the first time, the journalist saw a faint outline of its features, a face warped with impossible angles, a mouth frozen in an eternal expression that was neither smile nor scream, and eyes that conveyed an intelligence far beyond innocence. It tilted its head and beckoned with a slow, deliberate gesture, urging the journalist to follow. Despite fear clawing at every nerve, a part of them obeyed, drawn by the irresistible compulsion that had haunted the orphanage for decades. The figure did not speak, yet its presence conveyed a silent understanding. The orphanage's secrets were not dormant, and the journalist had crossed the threshold into a place where the dead and the malformed were not gone but lingering, aware, and waiting to claim the witness who had dared to uncover them. The journalist followed the apparition through a labyrinth of corridors that twisted and shifted as if the building itself were reshaping to lead them somewhere inevitable. Each step amplified the sense of dread, the shadows clinging closer, whispering unintelligible words that seemed almost sentient. The air grew heavy, damp, and metallic, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay mixed with the faint, chemical tang of old experiments. At the end of the hallway, they reached a massive door, blackened and scorched, unlike any other in the orphanage, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the journalist's own heartbeat. The childlike apparition paused, hovering just beyond the threshold, its gaze urging them forward, a silent insistence that the truth awaited inside. With trembling hands, the journalist pushed the door open and stepped into a vast chamber that immediately stole their breath. The room was filled with remnants of a life and a mind twisted beyond reason. Rusted instruments lined tables, jars of strange specimens glimmered under the weak beam of the flashlight, and mannequins posed in grotesque imitation of human children stood like silent sentinels. But the most horrifying sight was a single figure at the far end of the room, shrouded in shadow, seated behind a desk that had once belonged to the mastermind of this orphanage. Though decades had passed, the figure's presence was tangible, almost alive. It radiated a calculated malice, a lingering intent that suggested that the architect of these horrors had never truly left. Scattered documents, journals, and photographs littered the floor around the figure, detailing every deformity, every ritual, every twisted experiment conducted over years. The journalist realized with a sickening clarity that this was the very mind behind the orphanage's atrocities, a presence that had manipulated life itself, creating children as vessels of grotesque design, recording, observing, and perfecting their deformities. The sense of being watched became overwhelming. It was not just the shadows, the whispers, or the apparition, it was the unmistakable awareness of the figure itself, patient, intelligent, and ready to confront any intruder. A low, almost imperceptible vibration filled the room, like the building itself had synchronized with the figure's intent. The child apparition drifted closer, circling the journalist, its hollow eyes reflecting the depth of the horror they were witnessing. The realization sank in that this confrontation was not only with the remnants of a madman's work but with the enduring will behind it, a malevolent presence that had orchestrated a cycle of deformity, pain, and obsession, one that had survived through the walls, the shadows, and the lives it had touched. The room seemed to pulse with the memory of every scream, every twisted success, every silent failure, and the journalist understood that the confrontation was not optional. The orphanage, its mastermind, and the lingering victims were all aware, all waiting, and all unwilling to release its latest witness without exacting a price that had been prepared for decades. The journalist's heart raced as the enormity of the orphanage's intent pressed down like a physical weight. The further they moved through the sprawling chambers, the more the walls seemed to constrict, narrowing the corridors as if guiding them toward a destination already determined by some unseen hand. Shadows twisted and elongated unnaturally, responding to the journalist's every movement, whispering words that were half warnings, half invitations, laced with a cruel promise that the building would not let them leave unscathed. The childlike apparition appeared once more, floating just ahead, urging them forward with impossible patience. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to run, yet there was a pull, a compulsion woven into the very air, that made retreat impossible. The corridors led them to a room that was impossibly large, yet claustrophobic, filled with the remnants of decades of grotesque experimentation. The air smelled thickly of iron, decay, and something more abstract, something alive and waiting. Instruments lay strewn across tables, jars with malformed specimens lined the shelves, and photographs stared down like silent witnesses. The apparition hovered near the center of the room, and the journalist realized with dawning horror that the space was not merely a chamber but a culmination of the orphanage's design, a shrine to its unbroken cycle of deformity, suffering, and observation. Here, the line between past and present blurred. The experiments that had been conducted decades ago seemed to pulse with residual energy, as if the room itself remembered each act of cruelty. A subtle tremor ran beneath the journalist's feet, as though the building were breathing, aware of their presence, and unwilling to release them. The whispers rose in intensity, no longer distant but surrounding the intruder in a suffocating chorus, pleading and commanding at once. The childlike figure circled slowly, eyes hollow yet intelligent, guiding the journalist to the far end of the room where a trapdoor, barely visible beneath debris, hinted at escape. But the journalist hesitated, realizing the trapdoor was part of the design, a lure rather than salvation. The orphanage, the mastermind, and the lingering spirits had anticipated this intrusion. Every path, every movement, every sensation had been accounted for. As they crouched to open the trapdoor, a sudden, overwhelming presence pressed against the mind, a weight of centuries of obsession and cruelty, a realization that leaving was not merely difficult, but perhaps impossible. The whispers coalesced